New Zealand is a relatively insignificant country in terms of population, economic power, military might, and so on. Despite all of this, New Zealand has become somewhat popular and even a bit trendy these days. As a result, you might know, or at least think you know, a few things about New Zealand already. Well, in today's video, I'm going to show you that some of the common ideas that many people around the world claim to quote unquote know or believe about New Zealand are completely and utterly wrong. Common misconception number 1. New Zealand is part of Australia. This one is perhaps one of the most common misconceptions that us Kiwis hear from people from all over the world. It probably comes from the fact that a lot of people have a terrible concept of distances, so when they see New Zealand on an atlas, they notice that there's not much else around and Australia is in the region, so by that logic, New Zealand equals part of Australia? Now, some particular smartasses out there might say, well, actually, New Zealand was part of Australia because it was part of New South Wales in 1841. Wrong. Yes, New Zealand was administered by the government of New South Wales for a few months from 1840 to 1841, but New South Wales does not equal Australia. The nation of Australia didn't even exist until 1901, when the Commonwealth of Australia was formed. Fun fact, New Zealand was one of the original colonies invited to form the Federation of Australia, but said, nah. The two countries aren't even close geographically. The shortest distance between the two countries is 1,700 kilometers, or that's 1,056 miles in old money. If you think that's close enough to justify the argument that New Zealand should be part of Australia, then by the same logic, the UK and Ukraine should be the same country. Common misconception number 2. The Sydney Harbour Bridge connects to New Zealand. Keeping with the theme of how many misconceptions about New Zealand are all about how we're not Australia, this next one is something I've heard from time to time. The idea that New Zealand and Australia are connected by the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Now, if you've been paying attention, then you've already learned that New Zealand is literally 1,000 miles away from Australia, so it would take a marvel of human engineering to create a bridge that long. Never mind the time and number of toilet breaks you'd need to take along the way. Where does this idea come from? It's probably because some people see that Sydney has a harbour bridge and Auckland has a harbour bridge, and again, the inability of some people to conceptualize actual distances means that they'll look at a map of the world, ask themselves how far New Zealand is from Australia, measure the distance on the map with their thumb and forefinger and say to themselves, that far. So let's drive over for the afternoon and get back to Sydney before dinner. Common misconception number 3. New Zealand is 1950s England. This is something I distinctly remember hearing in a pub when I was traveling around England. It was from a guy who was probably around the same age as me at the time. When he learned that I'm from New Zealand, he went on to question me about life in New Zealand, and his curiosity stemmed from his personal beliefs that somehow New Zealanders all live in small villages where the houses are made of stone masonry and people drive their Morris Minors once a week on a Sunday to the local village church. Basically middle-class English life in the 1950s. I mean, he was partly right about the cars, I guess. Back in the 80s, it wasn't uncommon to see old 60s and 70s model British-made cars like the attractively curved Triumph 2.5i or the beautifully named Hillman Hunter all over New Zealand roads in various states of repair, because in those days, cars were horrendously expensive in New Zealand. Therefore, their owners just drove them into the ground until cheap second-hand Japanese cars with dubious odometer readings became the norm in New Zealand. Nevertheless, New Zealand isn't like 1950s England. It's a modern-day Western economy complete with all the problems that come with life in the 21st century. Common misconception number 4. There are sheep everywhere. This next misconception about New Zealand is an extremely widely held one, and it also ties in nicely with the image of New Zealand being some quaint little 1950s English countryside village-scape. Now, it's true that New Zealand has for the longest time been one of the world's largest producers of sheep and sheep-related goods. But did you know that New Zealand's overall sheep herd has been on a steady decline since the 90s? New Zealand reached peak sheep in the early 1980s when sheep outnumbered humans in the country by 22 to 1. These days, we're down to a measly 6 sheep for every man, woman, or child in New Zealand. But it's still a high ratio of sheep to humans, whichever way you look at it. And despite this, contrary to a lot of people's beliefs, there are no sheep roaming New Zealand streets, shopping malls, or schools. Like everywhere else in the world, the only place you'll see farm animals is in, a farm. Common misconception number 5. New Zealand has kangaroos and any other Australian animal. Once again, another misconception about New Zealand that involves not being Australia. So because New Zealand is after all part of Australia that you can even drive to, it makes sense that all the famous animals and wildlife that you get in Australia, like kangaroos, koalas, and crocodiles, would all be present in New Zealand, right? Well, over 1,000 miles of ocean and being part of a completely different continental landmass means that just about any stereotypically Australian animal doesn't exist and has never existed in New Zealand. There aren't any kangaroos, there aren't any wombats, there aren't any snakes. In fact, New Zealand's native flora and fauna is remarkably tame and safe. There's almost nothing in New Zealand's wildlife that can kill you. Except for the terrifying drop wetter, ancient New Zealand insects the size of a mouse that can fall onto unsuspecting victims at any moment from the tall kauri trees and jab you with their stinger. One sting from her and they go limp as a boned fish. But seriously, apart from wild pigs in the bush, there aren't really any animals in New Zealand that you have to worry about. And while I said that we don't have any typically Australian animals in New Zealand, it does have to be pointed out that in the late 1800s, this dim-witted posh bloke, Sir George Grey, a former governor of New Zealand, thought it'd be nice to turn New Zealand into a land of hunting and game and adventure for him and all his posh mates in their free time. So he helped introduce a load of animals from Australia and elsewhere into New Zealand, like wallabies and possums and rabbits, cats, wild pigs, etc. Wallabies and possums have caused major damage to New Zealand's native wildlife, and the government is currently at war with the little buggers in an effort to wipe them out completely from our shores. So there you have it. Now, of course, there are many other misconceptions held about New Zealand that are of varying degrees of ridiculousness, but the ones that I've highlighted here today are just some of the most common. By all means, if you've heard of some crazy ideas and misconceptions about New Zealand yourself, leave them in a comment below and I can maybe add them to another video. Thanks for watching.